Hello, this is Dr. Nelva Lee. I am the CEO and founder of MiTio Inc. And today we'll be presenting on engaging a diverse remote workforce. So what will be achieved today? Here are the goals for today's presentation. Better understanding of your diverse group of workers, tools that you can use to which you can engage your diverse workforce, and why groups from different continents differ in their approach to different tasks. We'll also really delve into how different cultures are challenged, or let's say use technology in a different way, and how to engage your diverse workers, also your different generational workers, so millennials versus boomers, etc. And lastly, discovering the joys of a diverse workforce. So as I mentioned, I am Dr. Nelva Lee. I am a native of Panama. I speak Spanish and Spanish fluently and French conversationally. I have over 30 years of healthcare experience and have worked in various medical settings, outpatient, inpatient, private, public institutions. I have worked as a professor for over 20 years for both graduate and undergraduate courses. And I have a PhD in healthcare administration. Together with my husband of 22 years, we have 3 beautiful children, to include an adopted daughter from Puerto Rico and 2 boys, 13 and 21 years of age. All right, so here are some of the problems that we're going to tackle today. So problem number 1, do you routinely conduct video-based meetings with a team from across the globe or time zones? Problem number 2, does your team routinely get into communication jams due to cultural differences? Number 3, are there major generational gaps between your team members resulting in stalemates? And number 4, is everyone tired of video conferences but can't think of alternatives? So we're going to tackle all these solutions and much more during this presentation. So problem number 1, do you routinely conduct video-based meetings with a team from across the globe or time zones? So that is the reality, right, of today's world, especially post-COVID, that we have a lot of our employees that are working from home remotely. And there's usually, historically, a challenge with engaging your diverse workforce. Then you add on top of that the challenge of a remote workforce, and that becomes even more of an issue, right? So here's what we are going to try to do. So number 1 is better understanding of your diverse workforce. So some of the things that we definitely recommend our clients to do is to be open to learn about not just about individual differences, but of cultural differences with your team, okay? So a lot of times we'll tackle individual differences. We say, okay, everyone's different, everyone has a different perspective, but have you thought about how cultures also are different and have different perspectives? And also it's important to be aware that the world map, different cultures, depending on where they are in different continents, have a different way of approaching things, okay? And so that's important because specifically for global companies, it's important to know, it's important to know, specifically for global companies, that every continent has its own historical background, and every continent usually has its own language and cultural diversity that was kind of baked into it through generations, okay? Lastly, for this specific understanding of your remote workforce, it's important to know that there are different scales, okay? And we'll delve into that a little bit more, but specifically in the areas of communication, whether it's high context versus low context, whether they are direct negative feedback givers versus indirect Negative feedback givers, how do they persuade? Do they use principles first, that's like research first, or are they more applications-based, persuasive people? Do they lead versus with egalitarian versus a hierarchical type of framework? Okay, how do they make decisions? Is it consensual? Everyone kind of has a piece of the decision making, or is it top down? Do we trust based on task-based trust, such as the Western world, very contract-based, right? Or is it relational based? Do we have to break bread, right, to be able to trust? Are disagreements solved confrontationally or by avoiding? And lastly, scheduling. Is that linear time? You know, the Western world loves their linear time. At 2 o'clock, our meeting is going to start, versus flexible time. More, you know, your African countries or your Asian countries have more of a flexible time when they're doing their scheduling. So we're going to really delve into some of these issues. All right. So here we have a few ideas, first of all, that you need to keep in mind before you are looking at specific cultures. Okay, so are you hiring a representative sample of that general population? Okay, that's really important because unless you have a critical mass of individuals in each representative group, they're not going to feel comfortable to even speak out or speak up about their specific needs. And you're not even going to be able to really address those things because they're not going to feel that they have a seat at the table. But once you have that representative sample, are you giving them a seat at the table? Are you giving them the opportunities to voice their opinion and to be heard? Okay. And one of the ways that we encourage companies to do that is through a pre and post assessment. Okay. A cultural mapping pre and post assessment is so important because that pre-assessment will tell you where all of your gaps are as a company. And then the post assessment will then tell you whether or not you address most of them or if you still have more to go. Okay. So it's very important that you discover your cultural relativity, like your place in those scales. So if you are, say, from a Western culture that likes your scheduling to be linear or likes your decisions to be consensual, and then you're dealing with another culture that is the opposite of you, you need to be able to know where you stand with that other culture and how to really go about addressing communication issues that might arise because of those differences. The most important thing is to be open-minded. Anytime you believe that your way is the right way, or it's my way or the highway, that is when you're going to start having issues in communication and breakdown in communication. So it's so very important that the first thing that you need to do is to have an open mind. You need to be able to approach communicating with another culture with your 2 ears and your 1 mouth. That's why God gave us 2 ears and 1 mouth, right? To be able to listen twice as much as we talk. And just being aware that culture is, as I mentioned earlier, it's an interplay of language and history. Everyone arrived at their perspective because of centuries of decisions, because of centuries of history. And it's very important to be able to take that into consideration. I'll give you an example. The United States is a low context culture versus a high context culture such as Japan. Low context means that you have to spell everything out. Everything has to be spelled out in communication. Whereas in Japan, if you spell things out, people think that they're dumb. And they really value being able to read between the lines. That's high context. Well, why did the US develop as a low context culture? Well, for starters, we are a very young nation, a little bit over 200 years. And we're a nation of immigrants, right? And so lots of different cultures. So everyone had to spell things out. Everyone had to be very specific and precise if communication was going to take place. You couldn't assume things. Whereas Japan is a very old culture, right? Several thousand years old. And they were very isolated for most of those years of their culture, which means that everyone had a very homogenous way of worldview, way of thinking. And so you didn't have to spell everything out because you could have very nuances that everyone will pick up, right? Just kind of like think of a marriage. When you're first married, those first couple of years, you kind of have a lot of communication problems. Why? Because you really don't know where that person is coming from half the time. But after you've been married 10, 20, 30 years, there's a built-in understanding. And therefore, you don't have to spell everything out because I understand. Sometimes you finish that person's sentences because you know where they're going. Same with cultures. So high context cultures such as Japan have that baked in history, have that baked in, camaraderie, and therefore they don't have to spell everything out. But if you are dealing with someone from Japan that's used to valuing high context and you spell everything out, communication can break down because they might think that you are implying that they don't understand or that they can't come to an understanding without everything being written down or spelled out. The exact opposite is when you're dealing with someone from the US. If a Japanese person does not spell everything out, there will be communication problems because we are used to that. And so understanding your position in that scale is so important, and also understanding the interplay of history, of language and history. Lastly, it's important that you identify the strategies that are needed to be able to deal with those different cultures, right? So strategies have to be very specific to the culture that you're working with in relation to your own culture. All right. So let's go to problem number 2. So actually, before we do that, I like to ask a question. Does anyone have an example of one of the scales when you were dealing with another culture, of one of the low context versus high context, direct negative feedback versus indirect negative feedback, persuasions with research versus application? Does anyone have any examples of a conflict that you had? All right, well, that's okay. If you don't, we'll ask again. Oh, Ali, you have one? Just unmute yourself.
I'm mastering this technology so I can actually speak now.
Okay. You said you had an example.
I spent 3 years living in Korea or in Japan.
Mm-hmm.
I spent 7 years living in Korea. Your examples are spot on.
Mm-hmm.
If you understand the word tolerate, I understand I was tolerated. At no point in time from the day I arrived in Korea or the 7 years I spent there did I feel a part of a team. I was the outsider. Exactly the same way I perceived my time in Japan.
Mm-hmm.
Depending on the level of the person in the corporation, if they were at the very top or within 2 levels of the top, I was deeply appreciated. But the remaining levels below the superior personnel, I was tolerated and was never supported.
Mm-hmm.
I'm I'm talking about in a daily task. So cultural diversity is applicable to the culture that you're in.
Exactly.
So you as depending on your level need to make sure that the pre and post assessment prior to implemental cultural training organizational wide factors in the diverse personalities or diverse people, because being treated the same as everybody else when you're not the same as everybody else means you're being tolerated.
Thank you for that comment, and we're going to delve into that a little bit more in the slides to come. But that is an example from real world example of how cultural differences can really break down trust and communication. So thank you so much for that, Ali. All right, so second problem is, does your team routinely have communication jams due to cultural differences? And I think we've kind of addressed that a little bit already, but we're going to discuss a little bit more. So we talked already about the different scales, right? And there's an amazing book that we used during our training program. It's called Culture Map. And in that book, it really breaks down every single one of these scales and gives examples of how communication can break down because of the position that the person finds themselves in relation to the culture that they're working with, and also the leadership role that they have. So I think Ali kind of touched on that as well, is that sometimes if you are in a leadership role of, say, the supervisor or the manager, the communication flows differently than if you are, say, an underling or, say, a project manager or something like that. And so really it's important to understand where you stand within that organization and where you stand within the cultural differences with the culture that you're dealing with the most. And just imagine in our teams today that we have people from across the world. And just in our session right now, we have someone that lives in the Middle East, someone that lives in Europe, and someone that hails from China. So we have all of these different, we have male, females on the call. So we have already a plethora of cultures, and there's a potential to have communication breakdowns if we don't address things very early on. So I wanted to also go into discussing the art of persuasion in any culture. So what makes me a good persuasive person in a Western culture may not necessarily make me a very persuasive person in an Asian culture, for instance, because persuasion, what someone uses as persuasion differs, right, based on your culture. So which style are you? Are you a principles first persuasive person or an applications first? In the Western world, usually America, for instance, we're very applications-based. When we try to persuade people, we try to tell them, this is why you want to do this, because this is going to be the result, right? We show them this is good, this is what the result is going to be if you do X, Y, Z. Whereas in more principles first persuasive cultures, they focus heavily the majority of their presentation on research. So say I was giving this in this presentation in a persuasive culture, I wouldn't even be talking about applications right now. I would still be going over research. Like it would be like a research presentation. You know, the type that you give, say, at a dissertation or something to that effect. It'll be heavily focused on research, research, research. People need to know that all the steps before they can even think about the applications. And so that is definitely a difference in culture. Another thing that we want to look at is just looking at your country's persuasiveness on the scale and the culture that you're working with. And so you need to be able to either change your persuasive take, change your style, if you will, to really accommodate for that culture. And holistic versus holistic thinking, for instance, is a very Asian cultural phenomenon. So, for example, in China, and I think maybe Pei can speak to this as well, they're very team-based decision makers and persuaders. Like you have to take into account the whole. Whereas America is a very individualistic, right, culture. We are very focused on how is this going to help the individual person on the team. But in China and in other holistic cultures, it's all about the team. The team is what's important first. And then when the team is addressed, then they look at specific persons within that team to make sure that they have the required resources, etc. And so really identifying what culture you're dealing with and what culture and what they value in that culture is so important. And just identifying strategies for how you're going to deal with that, with those differences. Okay. And I also love, oh gosh, sorry, I missed you now. I also love this slide because we want to look at different tools for unlocking communication channels. So it's really important, as I mentioned, the culture mapping that we do in our training program. It's crucial because one of the things that we do the pre-assessment to identify the gaps, but the other thing is that throughout the program, we ask each individual of your team members to do a blog to specifically address how they view themselves in relation to those different scales and how they view their team members. And so you're going to be building as a team a blog post from different team members from different races, different cultures, female versus male, different people from different parts of the region, of the world. And you're going to have this information. It's sort of like your own focus group and team focus group. And you're going to be able to really delve into the cultural mix of your particular company with that. And then we also have recordings. So video recordings of groups together. So you're going to have the individual blog post from your team members, and then you're going to have recordings of groups. And we'll assign specific consultants to each with each client to really work with you when you're developing that focus group. So you can develop a focus group based on the different cultures within your team or different projects within your team. But however you decide to build it, it needs to really serve your purposes. It needs to address those, the pre-assessment. So after everyone completes the pre-assessment, we will do an analysis and we'll give you a report that shows all your gaps, and we'll build those focus groups based on those gaps. Okay, so let's say the report shows that you have a gap in how you communicate with male versus female. Say you're a tech company. That's usually an issue within tech companies because they're very male dominated. There's usually very small percentage of females. They don't have that critical mass, and therefore their voices usually are not heard. So let's say that that's your case. If you're a tech company and you have that issue, you're going to want to make sure that your focus groups are addressing that. So you're going to want to have a focus group just with women so that they can feel free to speak. And then you want to have a focus group within the different teams that are specifically having issues with that, with those communication breakdowns. Okay, so it might just be specific teams within your company that need to to have a very intense focus group just with them. And then these focus groups will be edited and will be provided as podcasts to your company to further help you to identify, and not just identify, but correct your cultural differences going forward. So that's the MiTio consulting way. And so we are really excited because we are able to bring our consultants that have experience within the cultures and within that industry. And we're able to really break down the process for you. And then when you're doing that post-assessment, you're going to see that what areas you improved on and what areas you still need to work on. So that's the amazing thing about it. So one of the things that we also want to make sure that we're assessing is how much respect is required. So some cultures have a very high respect meter, especially for the leaders, versus the those that are not in leadership. So they might be very hierarchical and very power-based, like distance. They have a lot of distance between their leadership and subordinates, whereas other cultures, that's not the case, right? They really value more egalitarian work environment. And also the level hopping. So is it allowed in the culture that you're working with to talk directly to the boss, to the CEO? Is that something that is allowed? Is it allowed for me to go around my direct manager to speak to my manager's superior? In some cultures, it's not even an issue, but in others, that would be considered insubordination. So you want to make sure that you know the culture that you are working with, what is expected and what is not okay, what is not an allowable thing to have. Okay. So does anyone have any questions or comments about the MiTio process at this time? Okay, I'll move on. So problem number 3, are there major generational gaps between the team members? Okay, resulting in stalemate. Sometimes anytime something results in a stalemate, that means it's gone on too long, for starters. So if you have a stalemate of communication, whether it's between generations or whether it's different cultures, that means that the problem has not been addressed early enough. The sooner that you can address an issue, the better, right? In fact, we recommend that companies that are entering into global agreements or global teams, where they address these cultural mapping issues from the get-go, so that you can really put together strategies for how we are going to communicate as a team based on what we already know are some common cultural differences between our teams. Okay, so that's really the best time to address an issue. But if you get to stalemate, that means it's gone on for a while. And so you want to be able to address those because you can. You don't have to give up on the team. You definitely can address them. So let's just look at first at a few of the common generational issues that arise. For instance, oftentimes older workers are really motivated by things like traditional benefits, such as healthcare, pensions, 401ks. Whereas younger generations are not motivated by those things. They're much more motivated by flex time and extra training and things like that. It's really, they don't see a company as a place that they're going to stay forever. That's really a thing of the past. Whereas older generations, they still have a certain loyalty to the companies because that is based on their generation. That was what they grew up with, right? In the past, companies, a person could stay with one company throughout the entire working career, finish with a pension and a nice little watch and be on their way. That is very much unlikely today. Few and far between you will find that a worker stays with one company for 10, 20 years. It's very unheard of, unless maybe government workers, right? So it's really important that you understand what younger workers want out of out of their working environment. They want to be able to take information, take a learning from their employer that can help them be promoted in their next job or within the same job, but be promoted. They want to be able to advance in their careers. And that is a benefit to them. Longevity and loyalty is not a benefit. Also, flex time. They grew up seeing their mother and father, or even grandparents, working themselves to death and not having any work-life balance. And they don't want that. They don't want that for themselves or for their children. And so they really value flex time. It's not laziness. And so the older generation sees that as laziness, but it's not. It's not. They're just really adapting to the realities of their time. So it's really important. So statistically, 37.3% of your workforce is going to be the older generation. I believe this was taken prior to COVID because we are seeing in the Great Recession, or the Great, not recession, the Great Resignation, that the majority of the workers that are resigning are those older workers, right? And then 21% of the workforce is younger generation. But one of the things that we also want to address based on culture is how do other cultures achieve decisions? Okay, so we mentioned this earlier between consensus versus top-down. In some cultures, it's so important for everyone to have a say in the decision-making. American culture, not so much. They might have a say as far as how we come up, maybe in the brainstorming session, but at the end of the day, it's the boss that makes the decision, right? So we're very top-down in decision-making, whereas in Japan, it's the exact opposite. Even though they're hierarchical, they are very consensus building when it comes to their decision-making. All right, and also, how is trust delivered? Is trust delivered in the heart or in the head? Okay, and that's one of the things that we want to discuss as well. So is the way that you address a colleague and the way that you trust in a colleague based on how much respect you have for them, how much your relationship that you've built with them, or is it just based on contractual? And so American, again, are very contractual based when they're building, when they're entering into a working relationship. Whereas in other cultures, it's very relational based. You have to break bread. You have to spend time. You have to really know someone on a personal level before they can really trust you. Meals, again, are a way to show trust. But so is really showing your true self. Again, Americans really feel like there's a divide, right, between your personal life and your business life. In other cultures, that's not the case. It's all the same. So it's very important that you understand what's the cultural context and what is expected to really enter into a contract. The relationship is the contract in many cultures. And choosing your communication style and type is very important. Some cultures really value email, whereas others, the communication is all about personal, face-to-face, or even phone. But they don't value the email quite as much. Okay. Awesome. All right, problem number 4. So, is everyone tired of video conferences but think there's no alternative solution? Okay, I say this as we're doing a video conference, right? So there's definitely benefits of video conferencing. And I believe, like I mentioned earlier, we're all in different continents. I believe there's 3 or 4 continents represented today. So this meeting would be not able to even take place if it wasn't for video, right? But because of Zoom, we have lost touch with a lot of things that make teams work and make teams tick. First of all, let's back up and just talk about the remote workers' needs. Many remote workers, especially those that really value time with others, Not everyone does, but some really do get their juices flowing when they're working alongside someone else, even if that person is not working on your project. You have to encourage them to get out of their homes. Okay, for those people, especially if isolation is something that comes up a lot in that pre-assessment, I feel isolated. I feel like I'm not really being as productive as I'd like to be. For workers such as those, you really need to encourage them to go into quasi offices such as Starbucks or some other location where there are people around. Even if they're not working on the same project as them, they'll still feel like they're not isolated. And so that's important to them. And be mindful of catering to individuals. When you're working with remote workers, you don't have to stick to very strict 9 to 5, or everyone has to be working at the same hours. Be flexible, be willing to let people work at night shifts or early in the morning, or split their time. 4 hours at the beginning and 4 hours later. Be willing to work with them, and they will definitely appreciate that and show that appreciation with productivity. And then, as I mentioned, there's some things that can't take place that cannot replace face-to-face. So make sure that you're incorporating some type of face-to-face meetings, whether it's quarterly or annually, so that you can build that sense of community. That's very, very important. One thing I wanted to also point out is that there's different ways that cultures disagree. So you want to make sure that you're disagreeing productively. Disagreements are going to happen, but you're doing it in a productive way. And the main thing that makes it productive is respect. So if you're not respecting, let's go all the way back to the very first couple of slides, and that's being open-minded about the other person's culture. If you think that your culture's way of doing things is the best or the only way, you're automatically shutting yourself down and you're not being open-minded. So being open-minded, being respectful of others' cultures is the first step to being able to disagree productively. Some cultures rather, have to save face when they're disagreeing. Saving face is something that you probably heard in Asian cultures. Chinese, Japanese, Korean, for instance. They cannot be blasted, if you will, in front of others. So if you're going to disagree with someone, you need to do it in a very individual way, behind closed doors, so that they do not feel humiliated. That really takes place in a lot of other cultures as well, but more so in Asian cultures. So it's very important that you understand how to address confrontation and conflict, and doing it in a culturally sensitive way. Okay, so that's really important. So let's look at this next slide here. So let's look at how to deliver the promise of remote work. So I mentioned ensuring that everyone is heard and respected. Super difficult face-to-face, even more so challenging for remote workers, but it can be done with a little effort. So make sure that you are doing those pre-assessments, doing those regular surveys. You want to regularly conduct anonymous surveys of your workforce so that they can tell you how they're feeling, and then you can address those issues. So not just hearing their issues is important, but addressing them is important, okay? And train specifically for diversity and inclusion. So it's important, utmost important, that you are regularly highlighting your company's commitment to diversity and inclusion. Very important. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about lateness and culture. So if you live in America, you've heard of Black people time, right? That's one way that we separate culture just within our country and the idea of lateness. But that is really a very cultural thing depending on the continent, really the culture that you're from. And it's really because in some cultures, the idea that things are predictable just isn't the case. So that is one reason why people were raised, if you will, with the idea of just being flexible, being understanding when it comes to time. That is not a fixed time, but it's more like a suggested time frame. That is something that's totally alien to a lot of Western cultures. And so they might assume that people from different cultures are lazy or not respectful of time. Not the case at all. You have to understand the cultural, the historical context of that culture to be able to understand their perspective of time. Okay, so fixed versus reliable time, dynamic versus unpredictable time. Very, very important. A line is not a line. So what is queuing? What does it mean that I'm waiting for an appointment to start, right? Very different idea, very different perspective from one culture to another. Same with the meeting. What does it mean that a meeting has to start at a specific time? This is something very, very basic if you're working in a homogeneous culture, right? If everyone is from the same place, everyone has the same idea as to what that means, that a meeting starts at this time, or that it means the agenda of the meeting is going to go a certain way. That is a totally different concept if you're working from someone from a different culture. So I'm going to stop right here and ask if anyone has any examples of this. So I'm going to give you an example. So I'm from Panama originally, and I was invited to a quinceañera, which is a big deal for a girl turning 15, right? And on the invitation, it said to show up at 5 p.m. So I was there promptly, I would say 10 minutes early, because I was, I'm from the school of thought of if you're on time, you're late. So I was there a few minutes early before the party was to start. I showed up at 5, all dolled up for this quinceañera. Usually don't eat, try to not eat too much before I go to a party because I know I'm going to eat a lot at the party. So I was a little bit hungry already. Well, guess what? The quinceañera didn't actually get started till 8 p.m. Yes, 3 hours later, that's when it actually got started. I was gracious. I was not super anxious or angry because I understood that this is very common for Latin cultures. But yes, had I remembered that, I probably wouldn't have eaten beforehand, and I probably wouldn't have tried to be there right on time. So that was definitely and I'm from Panama, so I know better, right? But yes, that was definitely my lesson in that regard. But yes, it is a real thing, and grace really is the operative word. It's not becoming angry when things do not go according to your perceived way of how things should go. Awesome. All right, let's go to the next slide. So here are some of the joys of working with a diverse culture. So we've talked about all the challenges, but there are some joys. There are definitely some benefits to working with diversity. So for starters, it inspires creativity, all right? Because you have people from different perspectives, as long as they are respectful of each other, you're going to see the synergy that really would not happen elsewhere. The varied perspectives really lead to ideas when they're meshed together that would not have come up any other way. It improves strategic planning and decision making. Again, because of that creativity, people are able to come up with different ideas, different plans of action that would never have, like the light bulb start coming on, that would never have happened with a fully homogeneous culture. It supports innovation and improves product development. It fosters empathy and compassion. Again, if you have the right mindset from the beginning, a mindset of respect, a mindset of open-mindedness, right? Obviously, it improves cultural awareness. Even if you have a bad mindset, working alongside someone allows you to realize, oh, there's different ways of doing things, or people from different cultures do things differently. If nothing else, it causes you to realize that your way isn't the only way that things are done. And it improves productivity and job satisfaction. Again, if you have the right mindset. If you come into the workplace, especially if you're working in a diverse culture, and you come into it with this idea that, wow, I'm going to learn something new today. Oh, I love learning about new cultures. You're going to have a really satisfying work experience. But statistics, for those of you that like the stats, companies with a diversity within their company have 2.3 times higher cash flow than those that do not, than their peers. They have 43.1% higher revenue, and they're 35% more likely to outperform their peers. So diversity works, okay? So don't become discouraged if you're having issues with your diverse group. If you work through them and come to the other side of understanding and good communication, you're going to reap the rewards, okay? So I like to also remind everyone that it's important to show grace and to be willing to switch your style. So once you recognize that your style is not necessarily the way that your customer, that your teammate is really accepting of or understanding of at the time, be willing to be the one that switches your style. It's okay. Be willing to come up with this framework, especially if you are a leader, for how you're going to communicate with this team or this group, okay? And just realize that you can always identify a strategy that's going to work for you, always. So here's some steps if you want to work with MiTio when you're working with MiTio's consulting group. This is some of the steps that you can anticipate. As I mentioned, as soon as you start working with us, we're going to perform a pre-assessment on your diverse workforce throughout your entire company. That is crucial. You don't know where you're going unless you know where you're starting at. It's a crucial piece to do that pre-assessment and to really do the analysis and go over that report with you to know exactly what your gaps are and what areas you need to work on. Then we're going to train your diverse group workforce using the culture mapping and generational gaps training tools that we have. As I mentioned, we're going to do focus groups and blog posts, and all of that is going to really work to your benefit because it's going to be very unique to your company, those deliverables, and it's going to help you to really understand where your areas of need are and where you can improve and what are the steps for that improvement. And then we're going to do a post-assessment. So let me just back up for a second. The blog posts and the focus groups, those are all going to be guided by a specialized consultant that will be working with your team specifically. And then we're going to do a post-assessment. That post-assessment is going to be specifically on looking at the pre-assessment and what gaps you had and seeing if now you've addressed those issues and what still needs to be done. So in that post-assessment, we're going to be doing some shares because we know that you would have already addressed some issues, but we're also going to give you a very specific map, if you will, and some strategies on what things still need to be done. And then we will encourage you all to continue to do regular surveys. If you're a large company, probably quarterly. It depends, maybe semi-annually or annually. Depends on your needs. But definitely you want to continue to reach out to your team, to reach out to your diverse groups, make sure that they are still feeling heard, make sure that those issues that are coming up are still being addressed. All right. So these are some ways that you can work with us. We have our consulting website where you can book a call. In fact, I will share that website with you momentarily. Give me 1 second so that I can introduce my team. I like to introduce my team. Does anyone have any questions? So this here is the MiTio team. this is our consulting website, and I would like to introduce our team. That, of course, that's myself, Dr. Neville Lee, and then we'll have this video uploaded here as well. And here's another video that gives you a little bit of our testimonials of our companies that we have worked with in the past. But here's our amazing team of consultants. We have Paysan, Jonathan Logan, Tatiana Ford, Lily Drisdale, Cindy Mata, Nee Clark, and then we have even more. Yeah, a team of 50 consultants. And so these are all of our team members here. We're very, very proud of our team. They all are certified interpreters. They all have expertise in their particular languages and cultures. And the beauty of it is that they will work with your team to come up with solutions specifically for your team. So if you'd like to work with us, you can just book a discovery call right here. Just click on that and book a time with us. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time. We appreciate you considering MiTio for your diversity and inclusion consulting needs. Thank you.